Welcome back, Perfect Peeps, to Perfect.dev. Today on the podcast, we have Sam. Oh man, I should probably clear this with you. Sam Bhagwat?
Haha, Bhagwat. So bog like a
Bhagwat.
swamp, and what is this name?
I'm going to redo that, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome back, Perfect Peeps, to Perfect.dev. Today on the podcast, we have Sam Bhagwat. Did I get closer, Sam?
You got it. You got it.
I'm
It's a
terrible with
tough one.
names. I always have to apologize a million times.
It's great to meet you, Alex and Brittney. Super excited to be here and to chat with you guys.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Sam.
I know we're kind of pre-recording this, but you just got done with Gatsby Conf, and how did that go? Was it everything you expected for being virtual and all that?
It was pretty exciting. I mean, we had 10,000, 11,000 folks come, which is, I mean, we're just like really kind of humbled by that. We had we had a ton of cool product launches. I can talk about some of them now, or maybe kind of as we get into the podcast. But the new Gatsby image launched. We had e-commerce, a lot of new e-commerce functionality with the new Gatsby Shopify integration. We announced some things that we launched them a month or two ago, but sort of like highlighting them. Some of the WordPress 4.0 source plugin and WP GraphQL 1.0, and then of course Gatsby Cloud Hosting and V3 of Gatsby. So just a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
So what I probably skipped on, I should have done this up front, but Sam is actually the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Gatsby. Has that role changed over the years? I know it was kind of just two or three of you at the beginning, and was there a shift going to like that strategy officer position?
Yeah, so kind of a little bit of background as to like how Gatsby started both as an open source project and as a company. So Kyle Matthews, my co-founder, started Gatsby as an open source project just to kind of build a website back in 2015, and then sort of over time, folks started contributing to it. It kind of started taking off. We incorporated it as a company in 2017, raised some funding, sort of brought on a team. And then, kind of as the company has grown, and now we're just a little bit north of 50 folks.
Wow.
Things we've kind of matured a lot as an organization. So now, and so kind of as part of that, I've moved into it's a little bit of a interesting title, right? But what it basically means is that like I'm kind of helping folks who are sort of like doing kind of the most advanced use cases with Gatsby be successful, figure out kind of what the set of problems they're facing are, and help kind of overcome them.
That's amazing. So that's full-time individuals, right?
Yeah, that's 50 full-time
Wow.
individuals, and then we've 1,000 folks contributed to Gatsby in the last year. So it's the community is just obviously incredible.
Nice.
Not to like get too far into the history books here, but did this all start off like somebody's garage with an idea, or like where did Gatsby actually come from?
Yeah, so Kyle was working on actually another startup at the time, and he needed a website, and he wanted to build it with React. This is 2015, right? So React has just come out from Facebook, but like sort of the core, this kind of like core group of folks is like super excited about declarative, declarative UIs, and Kyle's like, okay, cool, like let me build something. Something like Jekyll, right? Or something like another static site generator, but with React. And so he didn't just kind of build the website, but he built the framework, then used the website to kind of build the framework, open sourced it. And I mean, there's, as kind of React has just emerged as the way to develop, there's been a huge, kind of surge of excitement around that, around Gatsby, to the point where in 2017, this was kind of right after the 1.0 launch. There's a sort of we saw sort of folks starting to build plugins in the community, a huge kind of surge of usage, and we kind of Kyle and I were Kyle and I are best friends. It's like super close. And we just kind of looked at each other and we're like, well, should this be a company now? and
That's the best way it can be.
and that sort of, it was like, I mean, it was really kind of, what we saw, right? Like, I think we saw that a little bit of kind of the increased usage over time. You see an exponential curve growing and you're like, aha, like, it's going to kind of keep growing, and people are going to want to build sort of modern web experiences with React. And to do that, they're going to need not just a great sort of open source tool, but they're going to need kind of a lot of additional investment, both solid integrations with all the various other systems they're using, and they're going to need kind of like hosted kind of cloud services around that, to kind of hook all these things together. And you kind of realize, you're like, well, okay, like that's more than like an open source project can typically provide.
Right.
Let's build a company around that, both to foster and grow the open source community, as well as to kind of provide the services that can help.
Other than Jekyll, wasn't Gatsby one of the first ones that really focused on that static generation, almost like Jamstack, like being the beginning of kind of where Jamstack started?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I think if you look at the history of like static site generators, right? I mean, even if you go back to like 2005 and movable type, and there was kind of a head-to-head WordPress versus movable type back in 2004. I mean, this is like way back, but like for a long time, like static site generators were kind of this niche, and this niche developer tool. It was great for developer blogs and personal sites, maybe like documentation sites, but they sort of lack the ability to add interactivity in an easy way. And so anyone that was kind of building something more complex would turn to WordPress, or would turn to maybe doing something custom, and then but starting like to the point, like the whole kind of Jamstack movement, right in, it started to change that circa 2016, 2017, and not to get sort of too much into the weeds. I kind of love talking about this stuff, but I think Jamstack is kind of an interesting term. It's come to encapsulate a lot of things that a lot of different kind of things, right? But I think if you break it down, there's kind of three fundamental pieces of it, right? Mm-hmm. There's the actual like deployment framework, which is kind of, hey, let's serve files on the edge. There's the modern development experience, so that's React and Vue, and then there's kind of the content paradigm, which is like headless CMSs, and the API-ification of sort of the CMS, being able to extract content out of it. And that's folks like, Contentful and so on. And so really, like the Jamstack, like you kind of need all three of these pieces to make a sort of a website that's like a homepage of a company, right? Like where you have content editors, where you have like developers, and you kind of, you're prioritizing users with performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. And which leads into the title, which I bury in almost every podcast at this point, but we're talking about content mesh. And I think that's a pretty decent segue back into it. I want to pop up, because I'm super visual. So there's people that listen to only audio, so I try to do my best here, but I'm going to pop up kind of a image that you have in your blog post about content mesh. If I can find my share screen button. There we go. So what this is kind of outlining is exactly, or mostly, what you were talking through just now, having kind of that traditional full stack CMS, whether it's WordPress or AEM or something like that. But then off to the side, it's kind of this newer modular based headless CMS architecture, where you have just exactly what you're talking about, with Contentful or WordPress or Sanity.io, or you name it. There's a million CMSs out there these days. But there's also kind of that build pipeline and images and like authentication. And that's where everything starts to really get glued together. And do you see like that's where Gatsby as the company is the best fit these days?
I think kind of both. But this is a great sort of jumping off point, right? Kind of continuing a little bit of that sort of the history, right? There's a sense in which for every technology that kind of takes off, you have that question like, why now? What was the moment, right, that caused that sort of like up into the right adoption curve? And with what was it in 2016 and 2017 that the Jamstack suddenly, even though it'd been like kind of used, the same kind of technologies had been used for 9-10 years, what was that sort of the moment? And I think that's actually where the content mesh comes in, and this idea of the content mesh. So we have like a website, to kind of think about what a website is, right? A website is a application that has to do a number of different things. Typically, it has to do it has to give people content editing capabilities. You have to save that content somewhere. You need a development framework. You have various pieces of functionality like analytics, forms, functions, maybe A/B testing and personalization, search. You need to integrate those all together. And then there's like, of course, the hosting piece. And then there's like then there's kind of specialized types of functionality depending on, maybe this is an e-commerce site, and so, or has an e-commerce component, and so there's a lot of additional functionality you need, right? And so historically, to kind of get all of that, the CMS emerged and kind of packaged that all nicely together. But one of the things that we saw sort of like in the first half of the 2010s and accelerating in the second half of the 2010s is the emergence of a lot of people of sort of services handling individual of these concerns. So you saw like Algolia for search, Stripe for payments, Shopify for e-commerce. Suddenly, when you have individual sort of pieces doing these really well,
those headless options,
it becomes possible. It becomes possible. Yeah, and headless is also an interesting word, right? Because like it describes each of these pieces as headless, but when you stitch them all together, that's kind of where the content mesh comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a website that's using Algolia for search, that's using Shopify for e-commerce, that has a lot, they're sort of like structured content in Contentful. They're what is it that's they're doing their UI in React, and they're using Gatsby to kind of pull all the pieces together. What is that, right? And like that's what we call easily stitch those pieces together. But it's something that isn't possible without the emergence of a lot of these, really good solutions for handling the individual concerns.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Sam, I'm going to just pause a sec. Like, there's something up performance-wise on video versus audio, and we keep losing it.
Oh, no. That's not good.
I don't know if it seems to be mainly on your side, so I'm wondering if you're having bandwidth issues possibly.
Potentially.
Oh, just froze.
Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. Now I feel like
now it's worse.
Sam. Oh no.
That gave me time to get a drink and put some lotion on.
I have this huge chunk of my day blocked off from like 3:30 to 4:30. Completely thought it was this. My schedule is a complete nightmare today.
Oh, yeah. You have so many meetings. I don't know how you do it.
I don't either. I'm starting not to be able to do it. That's the problem. Oh, let's see. Oops.
There we go.
Oh, yeah. I just removed him. There we go.
Is this better now?
It does seem better. Let me put you on the big screen and see.
Okay, let's test this out. How am I looking?
I know the video like was freezing and then trying to catch up with your words. I'm like, this isn't going well.
Do you want to redo that question or?
Yeah, if you feel like
let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we kind of let in with the content mesh, right? So Maybe talking back through like the emergence of that. We can start from there. Does that work?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
So it's really interesting to watch the question of why technologies emerge at a specific time. Kind of talking a little bit more about that history, right? Around 2016 or 2017, the Jamstack kind of took off. But why then and not sort of previous times? And the content mesh kind of speaks to all the other pieces of the ecosystem. Algolia for search, like Optimizely for A/B testing, um, the emergence of Netlify for hosting, and sort of all these different kind of pieces and components, right? You need a headless CMS. You need a okay, shoot. I'm going to retake that for whatever reason I got off.
No problem. Let me reframe it for you, and
Yeah.
then we can just start that whole thing over.
Yeah.
I know in the last piece, like you talked about Stripe and e-commerce, so and there might be usable parts of that too. So I'll reframe it, and you just go off the cuff again. I thought that was great, and we'll just splice together wherever we need to in there.
Sounds great.
Cool. So Sam, we were kind of talking through like that content mesh, and I brought up that graph a little bit there. Like the question always is, where did that emergence come from? Like, why now? What are the tools that made this possible finally, and kind of led Gatsby on the road it's on?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of things, right? The content mesh, the modern web, is a lot of things. If you look at like, so let's like talk about or like look at what a CMS is, right? So what a CMS kind of traditionally has been is it's been a sort of a system that enables you to build a website by combining a lot of different functionality. The ability to sort of create and edit structured content, and then save that content somewhere, a development framework, various kind of tools like analytics, search, A/B testing, to name a few, forms, functions, and e-commerce if you need that, and sort of like there's a long tail of functionality after that.
Yeah.
But when you had each of those kind of pieces, we kind of saw a technology vendor emerge. For example, Algolia for search, maybe that's Stripe for payments, maybe it's Optimizely for A/B testing. Maybe, and suddenly you're able to kind of glue all those pieces together with the emergence of React as a modern kind of like development framework. And so suddenly, like if you then have all these pieces together with kind of Gatsby gluing them together, like what is that website? I mean, it's not a typical kind of like CMS, WordPress website where you're like living in an ecosystem and taking kind of plugins out of that ecosystem. And content mesh was sort of the term that we kind of coined to describe stitching together all that various functionality to really create a modern experience for users.
So bringing all those like little headless pieces and just bringing them together to build the site out.
Exactly. You can think about headless as a way of describing the individual sort of components of that, and the content mesh to describe the system as a whole.
I think the interesting part there and what it allows you to do, like you've named some big players in this space, right? It's basically said, okay, best of breed you can now use for your website, and you can pick and choose what that means to you. Like if you're more of a video based and you want to go down the Wistia route, or maybe you're all just video focused, but you don't need the commercial side to it. Now you're into like Mux, it lends to that unique site and what capabilities that site needs and requires, and you can go pick the best parts of all these different APIs and headless pieces and start to use them together. I think something that you talked about there that kind of piqued my interest a little bit when we talk about CMSs and like the WordPresses of the world where they're completely combined together. When we take and look at this content mesh, I feel like there's still like a piece missing as we go through it. So I start to look at tools or maybe it's not even a tool, but things like StackBit, where they're starting to layer these items together. So like they take those best of breed and they say, okay, you got Gatsby, you need some static sites, you need this, you need that, and then it starts to put all those together and say, okay, we'll take care of like deploying and putting all those things together for you, and give you a browser that you can do all of your code editing with, right? So I feel like we're almost starting to turn that corner even further, where it's, you're taking all these best of breed pieces, but you're not stuck in like a WordPress only solution. You can still pop in other items to it. Is that fair to say we're headed down that path with the content mesh?
I think it's I think there's a lot of really exciting possibilities down that road, right? And typically the types of sites that modern tooling gets used for in the website world, right? These tend to be custom sites. So like you've got a development team, or maybe one developer, and like their job is to kind of like work on the website, and that implies that you kind of have a certain budget. And I think what some of the what some of folks are trying to do is they're trying to say like, okay, like let's take all these tools, but let's bring them to the site builder world. Something like Squarespace or Wix, or what Webflow is trying to do now, which is a different kind of part of the the market, right? The sort of the interesting kind of questions around around that is like, what degree of customizability do you need? How much, sort of like the WYSIWYG, the kind of the WYSIWYG editor is nice as well. Like I think we actually see kind of we actually see the emergence of folks using their CMS as a kind of WYSIWYG editor with Gatsby. So like maybe you'll have Contentful and Gatsby, and then you sort of integrate your component library with Contentful and Gatsby, and then suddenly you're one second.
Give them the timeout.
Yeah. So you integrate your component library with Contentful and Gatsby, and suddenly suddenly now you're able to like have your marketing folks in your CMS, and they're kind of dragging and dropping shoot, let me
like the images and stuff like that. So they'll take like blocks and place them into kind of that WYSIWYG flow, and like when you need a hero call out or something like that, that's how they're kind of dealing with that, right?
Exactly.
I think that the interesting piece that you talk about there, and again, it's all kind of going back to your article, which, by the way, folks, this article's from what, 2018, Sam wrote this thing. And I feel like it's even more true today than it was 3 years ago almost.
Thank you.
2.5, something like that. So you were predicting the future. I think Swick said it the other day on a podcast. He's starting to write the start of the history or something like that. And I feel like that's what you've done. It's come to fruition, which is amazing. One thing that I'm bringing up on the video for those of you listening, there's kind of this Venn diagram, and Sam was kind of talking to different pieces around this. And he has spelled out here content management, development techniques, and performance. And then the Venn diagram has modern tools, headless CMS, and website performance. And kind of where the content mesh comes into play as I scroll further down. I love visuals, right? So as we come into that play in the modern tooling, Sam's placed like React and Angular into those frameworks, and Vue's kind of in there as well. But the headless CMS is out the other side for your content creators. So this is for like your marketing team or your small mom and pops. And then off to the right side, it's got that website performance, and that's for the end result, for the site visitor actually coming in. And we've talked through some of the vendors, Amazon S3, Netlify, Fastly, which we can talk about in a minute, kind of what's going on with Fastly and Gatsby 3.0. But in the very middle of that Venn diagram is essentially Gatsby. It's gluing all of this tooling and CMS, or the content piece to this, along with making the web fast, right? And I think that's one of the biggest goals that has come out of this. And when we talk about Gatsby or Next.js as the tooling of the web for the future, it's all of this combined that is making it so powerful. Is that kind of summing up this article?
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thank you. I'm, you're summarizing it better than I could, maybe. There. So two things I think to kind of specifically call out and highlight. One, websites have a ton of different folks that are involved, right? And this kind of breaks down that by category. You've got content creators and marketers, you've got developers, and you've got users. And each category is kind of designed to optimize the experience of that particular persona. The performance for users, modern development framework for developers, and a headless CMS for content creators. And then second, I think that the sort of the intersection of those three is the answer to the question of why Gatsby and Next and Nuxt kind of have taken off in terms of Jamstack frameworks, where things like Hugo and Jekyll kind of, if you look at usage, I mean, there are still folks using them, but in fact, a lot of those folks have actually moved over to one of these kind of three.
I feel like there's like a story in there for the DX side, right? The developer experience for those tools is why you see people moving away from a Jekyll or a Hugo, even though they're amazingly fast. Like I used to run my site on Hugo. It's phenomenal. Jekyll, I don't want to touch because of the language, but do you have any like statistics or knowledge of kind of like GitHub was or is still using Jekyll? Is that probably the largest place that's still utilized?
I don't have a ton of information on particular people using it. The HTTP archive recently published a report on usage of Jamstack among different technologies, and they kind of highlighted some of the usage trends. I don't have that I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but that's a great place to go for looking at sort of how different sort of pieces of the Jamstack have performed over time, as well as they have some really kind of interesting insights into the kind of the various characteristics of websites on each framework, actually.
Very cool.
Yeah, I feel like both of you have touched on pieces of what makes the Jamstack so great and why people are migrating more towards it. Is it works good for developer experience, user experience, and for those like marketing teams and other people that are using the content side of it. It pulls all three of those together and improves the performance for everyone. Everybody has a better experience. So it's really good. And then pulling all those together, like Gatsby and all the frameworks that we're seeing out there now, are just holding that glue together. But that's why people are migrating more towards it, I think. It's just because everybody's getting a better user experience from it.
Yeah, I think I quickly did a search here just for the thank you for buying me a little bit of time there, Brittney. For the HTTP archive side of this, it looks like adoption of Jamstack, and I think this is probably the article that Sam might have read. And it just has this Jamstack framework breakdown. So as you can see, it's interesting. Gatsby is a lower sliver of that than I would have expected. So that would be an interesting.
Is that Nuxt?
The note that they make on the note that they make on that report is that there's Next sites that are both sort of static, and there's Next sites that are Express apps, and they don't have a clear way of telling which ones are which. So there are some kind of like actually non-Jamstack sites that get included in that, which
Okay, I'll put this in the details on the blog for the podcast.
The other interesting thing is that they have some HTTP archive data on like performance and SEO for different frameworks on that So that was actually, we were really excited to see that sort of Gatsby next to Nuxt. You kind of saw Gatsby's the site performance of sites on Gatsby was, I believe, like 10 or 15 kind of points up there. I mean, I think, but like what I think is like there's like a community, right? And like all of us are kind of like encouraging each other as frameworks to kind of like adopt best practices.
Yeah.
We've all learned a lot from each other. And we're all kind of like devoted to pushing the web forward together, which is really, I mean, it's like exciting to see this kind of renaissance of web development happening.
It is too. And there's been like a migration to Next a little bit because of that server and static side generation where you get the option. Is Gatsby always going to be static first? Or is there like something in the future, or is Next like driving you to wanting to do something with server rendering?
I mean, I would say that when Next launched incremental static regeneration, that was clearly like very popular. So that's something that we're watching closely. Kyle's been thinking about it a little bit, but it would certainly be it'd certainly be a lot of architectural work. So it's something that we're considering. Stay tuned, I would say, on that front over the next year or so.
Cool. I haven't actually done anything with Gatsby 3.0, and I haven't touched Gatsby probably in a good year, just because we've been so focused on writing everything with Next.js. And the discussion always comes up because for me it was, in my head, as simple as it can be sometimes, like Gatsby for me is a static site generator, right? And I know there's more to it now, and especially with the newer announcements. But the reason we went to Next was that capability to switch any page we wanted to from static to server side rendered. So it's kind of interesting to watch the two kind of play off each other and play catch up a little bit on features. But I think, with all of that said, I think you're absolutely right. You're making each other better, and you're making the web better as a whole. Something that I wanted to kind of bring back up, you mentioned the community aspect, though. I feel like, I don't know how you guys did it or who was in charge, but the community around Gatsby is amazing.
Incredible, yeah.
And just huge props to that. I mean, I know, like, I was pretty, like, I've used GitHub over the years for sure, but like to get into an open source project, Gatsby made that so incredibly easy to like do my first PR, get it accepted, get a free pair of socks. Like, that whole deal was just the best developer experience I've ever had for like putting an issue in and like actually getting it accepted. Unbelievable.
That's awesome. We love the community, right? We from pretty early on, it was funny. Like Kyle and I were chatting kind of like a day after the 1.0 launch, and his kind of comment has really stuck with me. He's like, I feel like I've kind of moved from, this is way back in 17. He's like, I feel like I've become like a tech lead, right? Like, I feel like it's just this sort of like huge wave of folks who like want to build plugins, and they want to, kind of add functionality to Gatsby. And it's like, they're like, I think starting then, there was just people building their personal sites would open source functionality, and then they would like want to contribute issues. They'd want to improve the docs. And we just sort of saw that and wanted to say, like, thank you for being here, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for contributing to something that everybody is using. Thank you for making open source better, because because open source is open source is a shared resource. And if we can like invest in a shared resource, public, like roads, or good sort of like government services, right? That helps all of us. And open source in the same way, right? If we have great kind of frameworks that we can use, that means that we have to do less as kind of developers. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can just use these great tools that other folks are using. And so we wanted to make it as easy for folks as possible to kind of give back and kind of build some excitement and enthusiasm around that.
It helps set Gatsby apart too. The plugin system was one of the things that just really like made Gatsby explode. I feel like the plugin system and Gatsby image both just set the groundwork for that to go to the roof.
It was like, so the one of the like amazing parts about the plugin system, and there right now, to give kind of a little bit of context, there's north of 2,500 plugins, and plugins can do anything from integrating Gatsby to a CMS or data source, to adding kind of like various kinds of functionality, like a sitemap to your site, or an RSS feed. You can sort of auto link your headers, so that you don't have to sort of when you're writing Markdown, for example, and you don't have to sort of manually write that. You just kind of drop in the plugin, and then it does that.
And it's really nice. And I feel like the starters do that too, Gatsby starters, where if you want to grab something specific, you can just go find a starter that's already got it included and pull it down.
And I mean, super similar with the starters, and I mean, I think starters are cool in their own way because a lot of kind of the plugins are super awesome functionality for the community to use, and the starters are in many ways like more personalized, right? A lot of folks have created their own blogs and portfolio sites, and then sort of open source the starter that they used to do that. One of my favorites is by a developer named Brittney Chang, who sort of you can kind of go to her homepage, but it's sort of like a beautiful piece of functionality, and then she kind of open sourced the code behind that to kind of show others, like, hey, like, how do you create this kind of cool UI experience that I created? And in addition, people will kind of like create starters as almost like packs of different plugins. So it's like, hey, like, I want to use like these 5 plugins that kind of play well together. Let me kind of create a starter with like these different pieces.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we kind of have circled around the content mesh. We've kind of said all the great things about content mesh and why it works so well. I think the other piece to look at is like why Wix and some of those other not Wix, some of the site builders that are so easy to utilize is the reason that like a marketer or just a small business can jump in feet first, and they can go to town just setting up a page and getting it just right, and they don't have to think about like, is this going to build, and all of these steps that it takes. So can you talk a minute about like the vision there for Gatsby and how to address that going forward? Like, us as developers, we love it, right? How do you get the mom and pop shops that can't afford $1,000 developer like into Gatsby and going?
Oh, totally. I think that's one of the big pieces of democratizing the web, right? You want to not just create these awesome technologies, but make them accessible really for anyone, especially folks who are who don't know how to code, and like who are interested in creating a distinctive experience for themselves. Right now, we're watching that. We're watching that space with interest. We're watching folks build on top of us. So one kind of interesting sort of thing to highlight in there is a company called Fisherman. And they're out of Boston. And what they've basically done is they've made a restaurant website platform. And so you have to basically just put in about 5 pieces of information, like, hey, here's my restaurant name, here's the location, and then like kind of you can do a very like 2 or 3 different customizations, but they made it kind of even easier than like a Wix or a Squarespace, because they were specifically targeting restaurants, and they made it sort of super easy to then to also offer online ordering as well, which is a big kind of like draw for restaurants, especially kind of like as COVID hit, and folks wanted to do that more and more. And they're actually built on top of their websites are actually all built on top of Gatsby. So they have a platform that sort of auto generates a Gatsby website, based on the kind of different configuration pieces that that people put in. And we're super excited sort of watching what they're doing. We hope there are, like 5 or 10 or 15 more different types of, companies doing this, building like, super easy to use tools for specific needs on top of Gatsby.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I mean, we are actually doing a similar thing, but it's for LMSs, and
Oh, that's awesome.
I find, and it's funny because I keep hearing the term like university builder or something like that, and I want to. Our code's fully open source, but I want to take it to that next level. So it's kind of an interesting concept to see something like this working so well. I feel like there's kind of that solution in WordPress that people can go to for somewhat of an LMS, and as you know, as COVID hit and as we continue to grow and move towards online learning, I think it's a huge part that we need to get into. Something that kind of what that brings back for me is the data piece to this, right? So when we're building this out, I had this thought, like, I'm good at Firebase, so we'll start there. And then I'm part of AWS community builders as well. So maybe we should talk about, using Amplify and AWS and Dynamo and those things. And it's this other part of this solution that, yeah, you can pick the best breed, but it's also difficult picking the best one. So I don't know how people like tend to go about that today. And our difficult part is we actually headed down the road of creating 2 different sites, one with the admin side and one with a front end side. Like, and this is great, but like some of the MDX and the Tailwind pieces, Brittney goes, this doesn't make sense. We have to like combine this. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. Like we pivoted and started to switch over, but now I'm having second thoughts on the data side to it. And I know early on, Gatsby kind of made a decision, and I think it's a great one for Gatsby, but everything is GraphQL based essentially, right? So the reason you have some of these plugins and things is because it needs to take those data structures and deliver them in a way that has GraphQL essentially, so you can consume it. Was that a very specific moment in time for Gatsby that decision was made, and what did that look like?
Yeah, so so I think to speak kind of to that specifically, one of the key challenges when you're, as you're kind of experiencing when you're building a website or, any type of application, is that when you're trying to integrate third-party services, it can be tough to kind of wrangle them because you're like, oh, like, let me figure out this API, right? How does the put endpoint work? How does the get endpoint work? Do I get a list? Can I paginate my list? How do I do filters? Like all these kinds of things you have to figure out. And then like, they're different for each API. And then so like you're going back and you're like changing, maybe you're trying to change your API fetching code, then 3 months down the line and you're like, how did the API work again? Like I forget.
Yeah. We're going through all that right now.
Right. And so like the kind of this was, we bet on GraphQL kind of big early on. Like Kyle started, building it in back in 2016, right? And then sort of shipped it in early 2017. And so the kind of the take was like, look, like don't wrangle all those other APIs. We'll pull that data in to our system for you, and then you can just use a sort of uniform way, a standard way of querying that data, which is GraphQL. And so folks found that sort of super exciting. There's also folks that like GraphQL is kind of like, I know that it's supposed to be great, but like I just kind of personally find it confusing. So we also have the ability, you can use fetch calls, as well, right? Like we actually have a docs page using Gatsby without GraphQL that talks a little bit about this. But most of the sort of examples and stuff are using GraphQL. And what we find kind of is that like people are excited not to have to think about sort of individually integrating with a bunch of services. They're excited not to sort of like figure sort of like wrangling individual APIs out. And then also there's kind of like performance advantages, because if you only you can grab only the data you need for a particular page rather than kind of parsing, this huge sort of thing, list of objects, or maybe you only need like one field from each object. you can have some significant performance benefits there.
Yeah, I mean, those are all the things that we're going through right now, using Firestore and kind of realizing, like, kind of relational schema is gone because it's a doc-based schema, and pagination is always a fun thing to get through. But I think for me, when I was first learning Gatsby, the biggest challenge was I was learning React, GraphQL, and the Gatsby product as a whole. And so it got very confusing for me to, like, you go through a doc and you like see a plugin and you're like, why am I calling GraphQL there? And then in the page, I have GraphQL again. Like, I don't understand this. And so it kind of took me a while, at least. I don't know if it's taking others a while to like put together the fact, like, oh, you're just passing it, like passing the data in and kind of consuming it in a GraphQL way. So.
And one of the things we heard was that, hey, GraphQL, like, it seems pretty powerful, but like for me, it's confusing. And so some of the things that we've done recently have been to kind of make it so that you don't have to use it for like specific cases. So for example, the routing, we launched a file system based routing feature a few months ago. And then the new static image means you don't need to use GraphQL to generate images. And so like those are kind of two of the biggest things that we were like, well, we sort of heard folks being, there's got to be sort of a simpler way to do this. I think that, like, in general, that's something we're looking into more is, how do we encourage folks to have like a kind of a smooth on-ramp? Mm-hmm. That can be like, that can be sort of like, hey, like, let's just walk you step by step how to make a GraphQL query, as well as like, kind of like an easier escape hatch to not using GraphQL.
Yeah, for sure. I think that story with combining some other things, like just pre-baked, Brittney talked about starters and like being able to say, okay, like I love Cloudinary. I'm an MD in Cloudinary, but being able to bake in the fact, like, hey, here's a whole solution that already has that pre-built just off an API key, having the GraphQL pieces explained better, like all of that just makes that whole experience a ton better. You said something which piqued my interest again. You said something about performance. I feel like we're running out of time on this pod, and I wanted to keep it on content mesh focused. Can I have you back on the pod again to talk all about the performance side of this?
Of course.
Sweet. Yeah. So with that said, and that promise from Sam, everyone just heard it. He's coming back, folks, for a performance podcast. We're going to jump into Purrfect Picks. So Sam's pick is actually up first, and he has a sweet book. Let me get it right. Here we go. What's this book all about?
Yeah, so this is called How the Internet Happened, and it's a really cool history of all the different sort of individual component pieces of the web that we kind of are used to today. So it takes you through, and like I was reading it a couple months ago, and I was like, I loved sort of like seeing it unfold from like Mosaic to Netscape to Yahoo to eBay, to Google, right, to the iPhone. That's kind of where it ends. So 1993 to about 2007, you see the emergence of a lot of these sort of UX paradigms we take for granted. Like in the eBay chapter, they talk about how one of their like customer service reps invented the idea of like rating a particular product and then surfacing that rating, surfacing sort of user reviews of like, this person has sold 50 items and they, their average rating is like 4.5 stars. It's like, well, we're just totally used to that today, but like, it's amazing how that stuff got invented.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, that's a pretty sweet book. I'll have to pick that one up. I believe Brittney wants to go after me in Purrfect Picks.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump out. Gatsby kind of related. I love the shopping cart setup for this. I've been trying to pull somebody in from Snipcart. So if you know anybody, prod them. Let's see if we can get them on. But I had a quick chat with their CEO. They're just slammed right now with everything going on. So I'm going to keep bugging him to see if we can pull him in. But we do have a couple Snipcart experts coming on, probably in April, May timeframe onto the podcast. And the plugin for this is absolutely amazing. And if you haven't used Snipcart yet, definitely check it out. Here's the Snipcart homepage. It's really easy to log into. set up all your products and get that integrated into a Gatsby site. Super easy, in my opinion. So check that plugin out for sure. My second pick, which I always try to do one technical and one not so much. I've been running a lot lately and trying to get some recovery back into me. These macadamia nuts, I buy probably too many pounds of them, but I go through these probably once a month, and great snack. Check it out. I don't know if everyone's into macadamia nuts like I am,
I'll
but
have to try those. I like pistachios, but I should try macadamia nuts.
it's funny you say that because that's what I always order is one of these and one pistachio.
It's funny.
Yeah. Okay.
I would probably like them.
Your pick is next.
So yeah, I'm playing off, and I've picked this before, but I'm playing off yours a little bit because you did the Snipcart route, and I know Snipcart has that 3% fee that we've talked about before. Yeah. So Use Shopping Cart is developed by Nick DeJesus, and it actually does what Snipcart does for you with Stripe. And it will allow you to have a shopping cart that persists through the app. But what they are doing now is they're actually pulling React out of it. So we don't need React anymore with it. And they're doing it with just Redux. And you could serve up just an HTML page with Redux, and it will connect to Stripe and put everything in there for you. So you don't need React anymore. But the other page that you just had up there, the Kiko Ramen site, is a working Gatsby example. So, I mean, you could add to the cart there. You can go to the cart and see.
The beautiful site.
Wow.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So, and everything is just stored in there, and it's using Use Shopping Cart. And then if you hit checkout, it goes over to Stripe.
Oh, that's so cool.
So all of this is kind of visual. Sorry, but yeah, everything with Use Shopping Cart. And so right now it is just React, but they are working on a solution, and it's working. So I'm hoping they're implementing it soon where it's going to be using Redux.
So we're gonna sell some AJ socks and stuff using this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Nick's made some really high quality stuff.
Nick is awesome.
He's great. And just a couple of my own, maybe, or a couple of Gatsby kind of plugs at the end. If you haven't already upgraded to Gatsby v3, it's out now. And also, try Gatsby cloud hosting. It's super cool. The builds are super fast. Deploys are super fast. Nice. Check it out. Move your site over and look at that.
Yeah, that's awesome. We're actually about to do a kind of a side project for somebody, and I think I'm leaning that way. So it'll be exciting to check out the full platform.
Yeah, it's great.
Very cool. Well, thanks, Sam. I really appreciate your time, and look forward to that performance podcast we'll do soon.
Looking forward to it as well.
Thank you for joining us.
Take care.
Thank you for having me. It's great meeting both of you.
You too.
Yeah. Bye-bye.